We're pleased to be joined now by Bob Costas. And Bob, you know, Tom and I have just been talking about this whole situation about not being surprised any longer when a big name pops up. But your thoughts when you heard Manny Ramirez being suspended for 50 games?
I think you just summed it up, Victor. Not surprised, disappointed, because it's a great story developing in Los Angeles with Manny, regardless of how you may feel about some of his antics in the past. The L.A. story has been a great one, and that now is at least temporarily interrupted and perhaps in some sense tainted going forward. The thing I would say is this. I would say this to any baseball player. I would say this to any elite athlete. Anything which is prescribed to you. We don't know what this supposed non-baseball medical condition was. But regardless, anything that would be prescribed to you, you've got to consult with Major League Baseball. You've got, or whatever your governing body is, whatever your sport may be. And please, don't take anything under the supervision of your shady cousin or your uncle twice removed. Is that too much to ask?
Bob, it's Tom Verducci.
Hey, Tom.
I wanted to talk to you about legacy here because that always comes into play with someone of Manny's stature. He is 17th on the all-time home run list. We now have 8 players in the steroid era on that list. 6 of them, of those top 17, have been tied to performance-enhancing drugs. The only ones so far who have escaped have been Ken Griffey Jr. and Jim Thome. 6 others have been connected to these drugs. How do you now look at Manny Ramirez's career? And this is a one-time incident from what we know. But how far does this tank go, and how do we judge him against some of the greatest hitters of all time? You know,
I think it's impossible to come up with a totally fair assessment that a reasonable person would be comfortable with. But we do know this, that even if a player was clean, completely clean throughout this era, if you played in this era with expansion, with the new ballparks, most of which are hitter-friendly, with the harder, lighter bats, with legitimate weight training that increases strength, with a whole series of things that are hitter-friendly, I'm just not convinced, even if a guy is clean, that because he has more home runs than Mike Schmidt or Frank Robinson, that means he was better than those players. It's always tricky, as you know, Tom, to compare generation to generation, but this is really tricky. Anything in the 90s and in the early part of this century, I just think it exists on its own. It's almost impossible to compare it to what preceded it.
Bob, and on that note right there, and specifically about legacies and the Hall of Fame, Scott Boras was quoted this morning in the Daily News talking about what impact this will have on, and he was talking specifically about Alex Rodriguez in the future as Hall of Fame voters start to put all of this into context, saying basically that every era of baseball's had to deal with something, whether it's a rule change, whether it's the Tommy John surgery and the like. Steroid era now is obviously a part of Major League Baseball. Do you agree with that assessment that down the road Hall of Fame voters will just take this kind of in stride and vote their conscience based on the era that they played?
No, obviously Scott has his own reasons, and they're obvious why he's trying to soft pedal this and discount it. The difference between the steroid era and any other generational or era changes in baseball, with the exception of segregation, is that the other changes affected most or all competitors equally. Now, you know, some player may have benefited more or less from a higher mound or a lower mound, but it was in effect for all competitors equally. Whereas in the steroid era, some used and some didn't. Some used a little bit, some used a lot. Some used for a few seasons, some used for many seasons. You have variations from era to era in baseball for a variety of reasons. But the steroid era was a massive distortion. All you have to do is look at the statistics. Unless you believe that by some cosmic coincidence, more than half of the greatest power hitters who ever lived all descended upon the game in a 5 or 6 year cluster, and mysteriously many of them were in the big leagues in the late 80s and early 90s, but never did what they did at their maximum performance level until the mid-90s or beyond. Unless you believe that, something extremely fishy was going on that's different from the changes of other eras, with the exception, I guess, not only of integrated and segregated, but also dead ball, lively ball. That changed everything. But in modern history, post-World War II, there is no change that, other than the breaking of the color barrier, which was all to the good, there is no change that comes close to the steroid era.
It is interesting, too, that he used the term pharmacology in talking about this era as well.
Scott has his reasons, and I think they're pretty transparent.
And Bob, I wanted to ask you about Manny Ramirez going forward now with this taint on him. I know there is a steroid fatigue, if you will, with the American public. There's also a willingness to forgive. But how do you see the rest of not just this year, but his career playing out? And do you think people are also ready to hear someone just say, I did it, I made a mistake?
Yeah, they'd be thrilled. If not thrilled, they'd find it refreshing to hear someone say that. But the difficult thing to get your arms around here is to separate the full-blown juicers who went to levels that they could never have otherwise achieved without steroids, and those who might have dabbled a little bit, gotten an endurance benefit out of it, extended their career in some way, rehabbed an injury. I'm not approving of that, but that's obviously a different level of offense than somebody who becomes a cyborg because of using performance-enhancing drugs, as we've seen several guys do. There are going to be, and broadcasters don't get a vote, writers like Tom do, there are going to be some people who are absolutists and say, look, if I'm convinced that you used any banned substance even once, even if it's a substance that wasn't technically banned by baseball until the early part of this century, but if you used it in the 90s and you shouldn't have used it, if you used it even once, I'm not voting for you for the Hall of Fame. Others are going to make distinctions about levels of use, and then there's the other argument that says guys like Clemens and Bonds would have been Hall of Famers without it. So, yeah, I'll vote for them, maybe after not voting for them for a few years as a protest, but ultimately I'll vote for them, but I'll never vote for Sammy Sosa or Mark McGwire. Those are different schools of thought, and you can understand them.
Bob, obviously it is, hurtful, I guess, if you are very close to the game to see these names continue to pop. But if you're Major League Baseball, do you take solace in the fact that, hey, we have a plan in place, there are ramifications if you should break the rules, and it's working? The system is working because guys are getting caught. Yeah,
I think this adds to credibility. I don't think there's any doubt that in that sense it's a positive for Major League Baseball. But I think, I can't speak for everybody, but my feeling as I was watching these distorted and inauthentic performances dating from the mid-'90s was not so much that I wanted individual players to go down. I just wanted the game to be cleaned up. I don't want to see guys flogged in the public square. And you've heard many players, Bob Gibson, Mike Schmidt, others say, Darryl Strawberry said it the other day. He said he never used performance-enhancing drugs, but had they been available in the 80s, he might well have done it. Schmidt said the same. Gibson said the same. Players look for an edge, or at least to be on a level playing field if they think that others are getting an edge in some way. I'm not a moralist about this when it comes to individuals, but I didn't want to see the game become some sort of video game, which is what it did for a long period of time. And I didn't want the generational comparisons to be destroyed, which they were, and that's more important in baseball than it is in other sports. So I want to see the institution clean up. I don't want to necessarily see guys' lives and careers destroyed.
Bob, we appreciate your time. We'll continue to check in with you throughout the day.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks,
You
Tom.
got it. Bob Costas.